Well, good morning. Y'all awake out there? Good morning. Good morning. I just preached last Friday at Fall Retreat, and I did not get up there to preach until 10:15 p.m. You know you're starting down when it's like late at night and teens have had school all week. So I'm glad to see that you're here and that you're awake. And I am excited. I've been praying all week for today and praying that this message would be one that would encourage you this morning. For 15 years, I was a high school volleyball coach, all up until the point of when I moved here to take my job in Massachusetts. One of the years that I was coaching, I happened to step into a head coaching role on behalf of the girl that I was coaching with because she was pregnant, and I had the ride of a lifetime. My team was just okay. They were pretty average. In fact, they were average in height. They averaged in at about 5'3". They were small, but they were mighty in defense. I think my tallest girl was 5'9", so we weren't working with a lot of high-leveled skill. Throughout the season, we won some, we lost some, but when playoff brackets came out, your record has a lot to do with where you get seated, and we were seated at the middle bottom, which meant that we were going to be playing Williamsport, one of the top-seeded teams in the county, a team that had lost the game once or twice. It wasn't very much. And so the night before a game, I sat with the girls. We watched some inspirational movies and things, and I said to them, it's going to be difficult to win that game, but it's not impossible. The truth of the matter was, I don't know that I actually really believed that. I was telling myself in the head because, that's what a good head coach does. But Williamsport was stacked. All the girls were seniors, they're starters. Ours were sophomores. Their average height was well beyond our 5'3", and the entire world expected them to come in and dominate. And so this task of winning seemed more like an impossibility than just some difficulty that we were going to overcome as a team. There are a lot of things that we deem as impossible in our life. Currently on my list, getting my children to stay in their bed and give me a full night's sleep, it's impossible. I don't think God's going to step in on that. Giving up my love for donuts, because I have a deep, deep love for donuts if you don't know me. I think it's impossible to give it up. And learning to love the cold weather of New England, I also think is impossible for this particular body right here. They're just things that I look at and I think, you know what, I don't know, they're not that important. They're probably not going to change. But then there's the other things, and they are the real impossibilities that loom over us on a daily basis. And for each of you in this room, yours looks different than mine. They're the prayers that we pray for that don't change, or the battles we fight as we wake up in the morning and we wake up knowing we prayed over something the night before and nothing's felt like it's changed, or we've just said, we wish this was different. Sometimes it's the things that squelch our joy. It's the things that keep us in the shadows of waiting. It's things that help us to question our faith in God, or even if there's a desire in the end for things to change. I don't know about you, if you've ever felt that tower, just this big looming wall over you of impossibilities. Maybe you're there this morning. But Joshua was standing in front of that particular wall. If you remember a story, it's found in the book of Joshua. It's pretty easy. His story starts at the beginning, and you see Moses, one of these amazing leaders that you hear so much about throughout the beginning of the Old Testament. Moses comes, and he's kind of sort of on his deathbed, kind of getting ready to pass over leadership, and God calls Joshua to take his place. And so if you know Moses' story, which if you don't, go to the book of Exodus and read it. It's in its entirety because it's an awesome story. Moses' shoes were pretty big to fill. They were huge shoes to fill, and if that wasn't hard enough for Joshua, he began from day one to just see there were going to be impossibility after difficulty that he was going to face with the people he had been put in charge of. The very first chapter of Joshua, God says to him, "Do not be afraid. Be courageous and know that I am with you." Before he gets into anything. To me, that's kind of this recipe to say, listen, what's ahead? I'm just pre-warning you. It's not going to be easy. So this task that you've signed up for, get ready for what you're going to face. It would be those very phrases that Joshua would continue to tell himself over and over as he attempted to take this group of people that had been walking for a long time into this unforeseen promised land that they knew nothing about. We find him in one of the most difficult situations in our passage we're going to read today in Joshua chapter 6. And I'm actually going to start a few verses back, beginning with chapter 5, verse 13, because I think this is the setup to the story that takes place. And so if you're reading or following along in your Bibles or on your phone, we're starting in chapter 5 of Joshua, verse 13. It says, "Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, 'Are you for us or for our enemies?' 'Neither,' he replied, 'but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come.' Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, 'What message does my Lord have for his servant?' The commander of the Lord's army replied, 'Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy.' And Joshua did so. Now Jericho was tightly shut up because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, 'See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands along with its kings and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have all the people give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse, and the people will go up, every man straight in.'" Now, I don't know about you, but if you think about that situation or that scenario, it has impossible written all over it. And I've been picturing in my mind this week, what would it feel like to be Joshua standing in front of this wall, having the Lord express this crazy plan to him, and here he is as a leader, and he's supposed to believe, yeah, this is legit. This is the way that I want it done. But before the Lord even speaks of the plan, there's a really important piece that I want you to see, and it's in that first verse of chapter 6. It says this, "Now Jericho was tightly shut up because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in." I would say that's kind of this picture we're supposed to get. This isn't an easy situation, Joshua. This is a place that's been locked up. This is a city that's filled with people who hate you and your men. We've padlocked the doors. We've gated things. We've built walls that nobody can get past because no one is going to get into us and no one is going to come out. I once visited a maximum security prison in Maryland, and they kept gating us in as we went, and I was like, oh my word, I'm never going to get out of here. I imagine that as they stood in front of that wall, there was a little bit of that feeling in their mind, this is impossible. And then the Lord makes this big, bold statement in verse 2. He says, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men." How many of you like to use GIF images on your phone when you go to text? They're like the little video images, with funny people. I personally like to use this one where if somebody says something that I think is stupid or I don't believe it, it's a girl that's laughing and she spits her coffee everywhere, because that's pretty much what I would do. There's ones where people dance crazy, they just do weird stuff. But I kind of feel in those moments as God unveils this thing to say, "I have delivered Jericho in your hands," that maybe Joshua would have sent that gift back if they were texting back and forth, because what he saw was this world of impossibility. And I think his reaction would have been what I would have had, which would have been more "I'm sorry, Lord, what did you just say? You have delivered Jericho into my hands with all the kings and all the important people? You have done that? Because last time I checked, there's a huge wall standing in front of us. And that's what I see from my perspective." And then the Lord reveals the plan. And if I were Joshua, I would have just scooted out or been shell-shocked or sent my second favorite gift, which is a chubby kid just laughing hysterically. Because he says, "Hey, this is how it's going to go, Joshua. You and your men, you're going to get them and you're going to march around the city once a day, but for 6 days straight. Oh, and make sure you bring the priests, because, priests are always the big, huge guys that everybody is scared of. And you're going to hand each of them a ram's horn. And a ram's horn, those are those basic horns, the most basic you can get, almost like a party horn. So when you blow them, it's that dull, annoying sound. You guys each need those with you. Because on the 7th day, when you walk, you're going to walk 7 times. But on the last time, you're going to blow those bad boys so loud, and it's just going to be this epic moment, and the walls are coming down. To which, again, Joshua stands there, looking at the wall in front of him. Have you ever had one of those times where like something's promised to you, and you're like, yeah, I don't actually think that's going to happen? I was thinking it's kind of like when my mom growing up would say, if you eat your peas, then you can get the brownie. But all you see is this massive, gross pile of peas, and like you can't get past it. It's a wall of impossibility of peace. Our real walls of impossibility, right? We face them every single day. We see them. Maybe we've been praying for something like a job. And God says to us, I will provide for you. I've got your back. I've got you in this. And we see nothing happen. And it's frustrating to us. Maybe we've prayed for God to take something away like anxiety or an illness that we have or something that's going on in our mind, and like we just wake up the next morning and we know we've prayed it out and we're in the same place the next morning going, you promised me peace, but I still feel fear. Maybe you've prayed for a friend or a loved one or a child that you've like begged to come to Christ, and like it's been years and you've seen nothing. And God keeps saying like, hey, the plan is keep praying. Be fervent, be patient, be watching, be listening. And the plan seems crazy. About a year and a half ago, I found myself feeling a little bit like I was staring at a wall of impossibilities as I tried to do youth ministry in this space. To be honest, coming into this space, I felt like I had all the right tools. I had the years of experience, I had the education, the schooling. What I didn't realize is how hard it would be for me personally to figure out how to do ministry in a post-Christian world where people are not interested in Jesus. I would sit with these teens here up in Sunday school in small groups and beg them to bring their friends and talk to their friends and bring their friends and just wonder, like, are we just going to be us, like the church people sitting here for the rest of our life? I think I actually went to them one day and was like, I'm not interested in that. Like, I want to see people come to Christ. And I hit this wall for me that was significant, like so significant that it kind of shook my core and began to question. I began to question, like, is this where God wants me? Is this the calling that God has on my life? And I felt like a little bit of my joy had been sucked out. I also felt like I was believing a lot of lies of the enemy, like lies that I wasn't good enough, I wasn't called, I wasn't the right person for the job, and my perspective was on my impossibilities. And I wasn't really sure what to do with that. Joshua was faced with an impossibility, and God had given him this mission. He had given him this massive group. I mean, they were following him. They were ready. There was just one big thing that stood in the way, and it was the wall, an immovable wall in the eyes of his people. And Joshua could have stayed there, and he could have stared at it, or he could have just spit his coffee out and walked away. But he remembered that God's power is greater than our impossibilities. God's power is greater than our impossibilities. And so despite this unrealistic plan and this immovable wall in front of him, he just obeyed what the Lord asked of him. And so what unfolded in those moments in the story is like this epic, amazing moment of what Joshua already knew before he got into the situation. That God is trustworthy. God is faithful. And so I want to read to you part of that story, again, starting in chapter 6, picking back up on verse 6. And we're going to skip through a little bit of it. So Joshua, son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, take up the ark of the covenant of the Lord and have 7 priests carry trumpets in front of it. And he ordered the people, advance, march around the city with the armed guard looking ahead of the ark of the Lord. When Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets before the Lord went forward, blowing their trumpets. And the ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. The armed guard marched ahead of the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard followed the ark. All this time the trumpets were sounding. But Joshua had commanded the people, don't give a war cry, don't raise your voices, don't say a word until the day I tell you to shout. Then shout. And so he had the ark of the Lord carried around the city, circling it once. Then the people returned to camp and spent the night there. They keep doing this and doing this and doing this. Verse 15. On the 7th day they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except on that day they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the people, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it is to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things so you won't bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you'll make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury. And then verse 20. When the trumpet sounded, the people shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the people gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So every man charged straight in, and they took the city. That is an epic story. And an epic story that I would love to be at on day 7. The day 7 where the promises all come to fruition. The day 7 where the plan doesn't seem as crazy because it unfolds the way that it's supposed to. The day 7 where there's a breakthrough. The reality is most of us don't camp out on day 7. We find ourselves on day 4 and 5 and 6, and we continue to walk. Or we continue to stare at times at the wall in front of us. We are to be people who believe that God's power is greater than our impossibilities. Whether that wall is our fears, our doubts, our insecurities, unanswered prayer, disappointment, we're to be people that believe that God is greater. The Apostle Paul tells about this when he talks about what Jesus does in our weaknesses. He says in 2 Corinthians 12, 9 through 10, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." You know, we were just singing a song about our thanksgiving and all things, giving thanks, and I sat there thinking, I don't typically give thanks or boast about my weaknesses when I'm weak or when I'm frustrated. I usually wallow and I complain and I tell a friend about it, and then I do all of those things over again till I feel better about myself. But Jesus is saying, actually, when you're at your weakest, that's when my power is the greatest. That's when I do my best work. And Joshua understood that. He and Moses had kind of done life together a little bit. They had watched this God move and work. And Joshua went in with this game plan. He didn't lead in a way where he hoped for things to happen. He led in a way where he expected it because he knew the God that he was serving. And so he follows this game plan. And I want to share with you this morning a little itty-bitty game plan. I would encourage you to even write some of this stuff down. That I think when you are faced with a wall and you're just staring at it, you don't know what to do with it, his story is an inspiring reminder of what to do. For starters, you want to start fighting face down. Begin fighting face down. Last week, we were reading a story with my kids. It was a ninja book, and it kept saying, like, ninja stance, ready, and they would jump up and they would, like, do this ninja stance. And I think when we think of fighting, like, if we're going to fight somebody and we're face down, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because you're pretty weak face down. When we're fighting spiritual matters, God says to us, like, I want you face down. I want you totally surrendered. I don't want you living on your own power. I don't want your fist up. I want you surrendered to me. And I think that Joshua knew that. We see that unfold in the New Testament. Jesus in the garden, right before he's ready to go to the cross, he's face down praying to God, asking for his will to unfold. If God's power is made perfect in our weakness, then we have to position ourselves in this place to receive it. And that position, that posture, is being face down, where we lay down pride, we lay down expectations, we lay down what we think we bring to the table, and we recognize our job isn't to be in control of the situation. And so we begin to fight face down. The second thing we do is when our walls stand tall, we believe that God's promises are central to our perspective. God's promises are central to our perspective. When we were playing that volleyball game, I'm pretty sure nobody's perspective was like the 10 of us that were on that team and me as a coach. We walked in and most people in the gym wrote us off before we even started. They were looking at height and not heart. They were looking at records and not work. It was just a different perspective. When I felt like I was hitting my head against a brick wall doing ministry here, all I could see was the people I wanted to be sitting in the seats hadn't come. And so therefore, God wasn't doing anything. I couldn't see that he was working behind the scenes and he was moving in the ministry, even on the days where I wanted to just walk away. God has a million things to say about what he promises. It's what we have his truth for. He had just told Joshua a few chapters before that he would fight for him. He promised that he didn't have to fear. When we're unsure about our future, Jesus tells us in Matthew 6, and this is my paraphrase, "Listen, don't worry, I've got your back. Look at the birds and how much I care for them. Don't you know I care for you even more? Seek me, seek my kingdom, and I will give you everything you need." When we feel depressed and we don't think that we can pray another day, Jesus says to us in Matthew 11:28, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and tired. I will be the one to give you rest." When we're praying for a miracle to take place in our kids' lives or a friend's life, Matthew 6:8, Jesus says, "For your Father knows what you need before you even ask him." When God's promises become central to our perspective, we stop seeing the wall and we start seeing possibility. It just shifts the way that we see things. It becomes not marked, possibility is not marked by our strength or our ability, but it just is only marked by God and God's grace and the fact that he's faithful. Here's the tough part of the game plan. When the wall is tall, we have to commit to the plan and we can't stop short. We commit to the plan at task and we don't stop short. I think it's interesting that Joshua never told his people the full plan. I don't know if you caught that in the scriptures. He went day by day. And so I imagine that as the people were following him, they're kind of like, okay, it's day one and we're tooting these little horns, like we're walking around once. We have no weapons. He was like giving it in sound bites. The second, the third, the fourth, the fifth time, they had to have been looking at him like he was crazy. But for some reason, they still followed. I believe it was because they knew the God ultimately that they were following. I'm just going to put this out there. God asks us to do some weird things. Sometimes he asks us to quit our jobs, even when we don't have resources. Sometimes he asks us to give our resources away when we don't know how we're going to pay for things. Sometimes he asks us to make changes in the church, things that maybe don't make sense or look like they make sense to us, because he believes there are people to be reached. Some of the plan doesn't always make sense, but he still asks us. And sometimes the plan is just hard to follow. Like when you start a club in your school and nobody follows you. Or he asks you to keep praying for that friend that you've been praying for like 15 years, and there's little to no movement. Sometimes just the waiting and the waiting room is not a fun place to be. When he's put a hold on who you are going to marry, or maybe if you're going to have children of your own, or even what your future is going to look like, sometimes it's just hard to stay committed. Here's the deal when we commit. When we seriously commit, we don't back down. We don't stop. We don't quit early. It becomes a non-negotiable when you're committed to something. I was watching a story last week on a player from Seattle Seahawks. His name is Shaquem Griffin, and I want you just to watch. This is a 2-minute video of what it looks like to commit to something.
We had a tall grapefruit tree, and all the sweet grapefruits at the top. Shaquem went up that tree with his one hand, and he swung out and grabbed the grapefruit. It was all from there.
Take your raise together. All right, up and down, never side to side, Shaquem. You got it?
Make it count. Go. Get their feet right. You a second behind your brother. You gonna let him beat you? Let's go. Come on.
Get them knees up. There you go. You know it don't come easy. Come on. You ain't ready to quit on me yet. Hard work, baby. Gonna pay off. We got this.
The only thing I was worried about is me having the opportunity. Hoping that when I got the chance, I know what to do.
Let's go.
Oh, this is one of their first pictures. It was coming back from the hospital. It was beautiful. Keem and Shaquille, they always pushed each other. Everything that they've been through, the struggle, they still didn't play Keem.
Having the game taken away from me. I put in the work. I did everything I was supposed to do.
Let me give y'all a better understanding.
1, 2, 3.
It's all about work. Putting in the work, putting in the work. And Shaquem, he believed. He believed.
I'm never gonna stop fighting. I'm never gonna give up.
With the 141st pick, the Seattle Seahawks select
Shaquem Griffin.
To watch your kids' dream come true, heart-stopping.
Saw that video this week, and thinking about commitment, thinking about heart, thinking about not quitting early, and what comes with that victory. That story of Shaquem is pretty amazing as he now plays for the Seattle Seahawks. Commitment is a choice. Commitment is something we do. We don't back down off of it. We don't quit early. Could you have imagined what would have happened had they quit on day 6? Like Joshua just turned around and he's like, all right, guys, you know what? We've been doing this for a while. Let's just quit. Let's just give up on day 6. They would have missed out on the epic moments of day 7. And I'm going to tell you, things change and hearts turn and mountains are rarely moved on day 1. They rarely move on day 1. And so just like Joshua, we are called to commit to this plan and to don't stop short. We commit to the plan and we don't stop short. I remember having a conversation with God about the ministry and about what I was feeling. And I knew, like, I was committed. I was 100% in. I didn't want to stop short. But the truth of the matter was I was beat down and I was at like a low. And I realized, you know what, I can't fight this anymore by myself. And the good news is we don't fight the battle by ourselves. When the walls are tall, we have to recognize there is one fighting for us. And he's a big God. There is one fighting for us, and we have to recognize that. It's not a coincidence that nobody was carrying weapons that day. It's not a coincidence that he handed out a bunch of party horns to walk around and look ridiculous with. It's not a coincidence that nobody was allowed to yell until the 7th day, because that is the way that the one that fights for us works. On his terms, in his timing, and on his power. It's just the way he does it. 2 Corinthians 10:3-4 says, "For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds." These walls that we face are not made out of stone, brick, and mortar. They are walls of unanswered prayers. They are in the spiritual realm. It is a battle to fight depression. It is a battle to fight addiction. It is a battle to pray for friends who continue to turn and go the opposite way. There are strongholds that have to be broken, that no hammer is going to break. But our God that fights with us and fights for us, he's already been breaking apart the strongholds behind the scenes. And he is the one that will get it done. We won that volleyball match against Williamsport. It was actually an epic battle, probably the highlight of any coaching I've ever done. When it came down to it and we walked in, it was a lot less about skill and a lot more about heart. We went 5 games. We won in the 5th game, 15-13. That is the best kind of volleyball match you can play unless you're on the losing side. Some of you have been there. It's not fun. That's a pretty epic moment, right? Underdogs prevail, impossibilities collapse, and a lot of seniors go home crying that night. You know what's more epic than that? Than a 5th game, 15-13 volleyball match that you come out on top? When you've been praying for God and he moves and day 7 happens. It's epic. Last week I was sitting at my dining room table and my phone rang and it was a teenager. It was Will Zargis. And I saw it was him, and I honestly thought he was calling me to ask me about this dodgeball tournament. I was like, I was with a friend. I was like, if it's really important, he'll call me back. 2 minutes later, I hear this like frantic knocking on the door, literally 2 minutes later, and it's his brother Jacob. We live about 3 blocks from each other. Swing open the door, and Jacob's standing there. He's like, she's ready. And I'm like, is somebody pregnant? Like, I have no idea who you're talking about right now. He's like, Gianna's ready. And I was like, what? He said, Gianna wants to give her life to Christ. And I'm like, what? I turn around and like my friend, it was Megan, was actually at my house, had literally just gotten there like 2 minutes before. And Gianna, who's here this morning, she's in the blue shirt up front. I'm not going to make her stand up. Gianna's a girl that we've been praying for about 2 years. 2 years in youth ministry. She is a friend of a lot of these guys sitting up here. And she came to us. Like, I met her at the parade it'll be a year, 2 years ago, this past, on Sunday, it'll be 2 years. I met her, I'd never met her before. She was a friend of Will's. They now go together. It's funny how that works out. But she said, I want to come on your mission trip. And I was like, you've never been to anything before. And so she started coming around. Came on the trip, started plugging into youth ministry, still was on the fence as to whether or not she wanted to give her life to God. Talked about it a lot, talked about wanting to give her life to Jesus, and it was a struggle. And we prayed for Gianna. The night before she came to our house, we had all been in this space, and we were praying over her, and we were praying over some personal things. That night that Jacob came to my house, and I took him in my car. I was like, we're not running over there. As he's out of breath, he just said, you had to be there for it. You had to be there for it. And I get to that house, and like 20 people get in this house, in the Zargis's living room. It's a pretty small space. ENC housing there, across the street. 20 people that have been prayer warriors for that kid, that didn't stop, that fought with her, that didn't give up on her, that did life with her. 20 people in that space. And it was as though like somebody blasted that stinking trumpet so loud and so clear, and every wall just collapsed. And it was an epic moment. So, yeah, it's awesome. And I tell you that story because it actually doesn't have anything to do with anything any of us have said or done. But it has a belief in the God, it has to do with the belief in the God who has been fighting behind the scenes. And it has such a belief in that God that people were willing to walk on day 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. Some of us this morning are standing in front of a tall wall. And you know what it is. Maybe for you it's something happening in your family. Maybe it's something you've been praying about and you just look at it and you're like, I pray every day and there's no movement. I ask God to release me from this and there's no movement. I don't know what to do in that. What am I supposed to do? I want to remind you that God's power is greater than your impossibility. Some of you have been asked by God, some of these teens in this space have been asked by God to do something. And you're walking around the high school and you're getting beat up about it. And I know it feels like it's day 4, 5. But if God has asked you to do it, He will come through on it. I promise you, because He's faithful and His power is greater than your impossibility. Some of us find ourselves in a waiting room. And sometimes that feels really lonely. I sat there in infertility for a long portion of my life. It's hard to wait. It's hard to rest on the fact that God is real and that His promises stand true. But I know this God. And I know He's a God that busts down walls. And I know He's a God that most of us in this room can look back and we can point to places where He has been faithful. And He asks us to walk. He asks us to walk until the walls come down. And so this morning, I'm going to ask for the worship team to come. Ironically, and actually, my friend this week said, you always like songs. Whenever I'm preaching, I don't know, there's always these songs that come on the radio or these songs that God keeps dropping into my life. And this song is one of them. It's a reminder that even when we walk, that we can turn around and we can look back on the way that God shows up. My hope is that you will be people that commit. You won't back down, you'll commit. Your perspective will be laced with God's promises. But you'll start on your knees, face down, asking God to show up. As they sing this song, I encourage you, you can pray in your seat. The altar is open if you want to come and kneel and pray. But whatever it is that you see as your wall of impossibility, I pray that you would know God's power is greater than that. And He is moving even when you can't see it.